Hello everyone, my name is Adam Michael Anthony Simpson and you're watching my YouTube channel, Adam M.A. Simpson. This is the part 2 of my interview with Rosa Chavez. Stay tuned and enjoy!
So this is long, guys. So Rosa, your research interests are in mathematics, education, educational policy, identity development, equity in mathematics, teacher education, racial and socioeconomic disparities, diversity in STEM, English language learners, list goes on. So can you first you've already fleshed out what quantitative research is and what qualitative research is, but in the context of your project, can you tell us or explain what quantitative work you're actually trying to do for your dissertation and how you're getting that information to, do all of these statistics to tell us something meaningful?
I've actually done some research that looked at, so I'm really interested in policy, right? Like
Yes.
How does policy shape mathematics education? And in particularly, how do the ways that we assess learning shape the education opportunities for students? So thinking about standardized assessments, right? Like high stake testing. Not sure if it's like common knowledge, but in the US, standardized assessments are required starting in grade 3 for mathematics, right? So it's every year from grades 3 through 8th, and then once in high school. Depending on the state, sometimes it's like at the end of the year, sometimes it's particularly to Algebra 1. So it might vary, right? But it's mandated, federally mandated. So I'm really interested in how that shapes learning for students. And so in my previous work, I looked at roughly 24,000 surveys of students that asked them about their learning opportunities and their experiences in their classrooms. And I was looking at how do students perceive their opportunities based on whether they also perceive their classroom to be highly oriented towards testing or not oriented towards testing, right?
Okay.
So by testing, I mean the state test. And so based on that analysis, I found that students perceived to have more opportunities in their classrooms when they were in high testing environments, right? So a quick read of that for us would be that tests are a good thing, right? Like tests create spaces of accountability for teachers so that teachers are covering material. And so it would lead us to believe that this testing means good instruction. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And a deeper look into classroom practices did show that, right? It's not as clear cut. So I then chose from those surveys 8 classrooms, 4 that were high testing, 4 that were low testing, and looked at video of those classrooms. So what was actually transpiring in these classrooms? And what I found was that spaces that were low testing afforded more agency for students. Like they had more intellectual authority. They were authorizing the mathematics that was happening in the classroom versus the teacher just telling them and giving them content, right? And the examples that students worked with in these classrooms had more real world connections, right? So one thing that's really important for me is how can we think about math as a way for students to make sense of the world around them? And I felt that these low testing classrooms created spaces that were aligned to that in ways that the high testing classrooms were not, right? The high test classrooms had more control of the students, focusing more on getting students to the right answers, and less so on wanting to make sense of the context of the work that the math that students were engaging in. And so then doing that analysis, I think, again, gives us a better picture of what is actually happening that we would not have captured by just looking at these surveys, right? How students responded on these surveys. And for me, ultimately, it raised the question of what is shaping how students perceive their learning opportunities? Where are they getting different ideas of what it means to be learning mathematics? And how is that connected to a focus to teaching to the test, right? So it makes sense that a student is going to say, if the teacher is helping me get the answer for the test, I'm learning. They're going to do well on this test, right? But then thinking more deeply about what is the test actually measuring. When we think about English language learners, for students that are emergent bilinguals, it's more of a test of do they understand the language and less so of a test, do they understand the math content.
In between this episode, I just wanted to bring out there that I've started this print line of my art through drawing and painting, and you can access the print store in the description box below. I'm just, putting my work out there, and please help me because I'm trying to, establish multiple income sources or income streams. So please check it out. Please help me. Thank you.
And that has been proven by research, right? So it really creates questions of like, what are the other factors at play that are shaping how students see themselves as learners? So now in my dissertation, I look at how do teachers make sense of these policies as a way to inform their instruction? And do they feel that it's a constraint to what they can teach, the possibilities, or do they resist? And in what ways they resist. And so more specifically, I'm looking at one classroom where the teacher resists this pressure, right? And it's like recognizing that she's being held accountable to this test, her students are being held accountable to this test, but the test isn't what she feels
is important
for the student.
Yeah. So can you explain, when you say high testing and low testing, do you mean high overall score in the test, or do you mean that's what you mean?
No.
Okay.
No,
can
question.
You explain? Yeah, I wanted to clarify that. Yeah.
When I mean high testing, it was meant to be that was a measure that I created by looking at questions that the students answered that asked specifically about the state test. So it was like, do they spend a lot of time practicing for the state test? Does the teacher tell them that the state test is important? So it's like very centered around, it's a high testing environment. Right?
Yeah.
So highly centered around the state test versus a low testing classroom was a low stakes, less centered to the state test, where students felt that the teacher didn't spend a lot of time practicing for the state test.
That makes so much sense. I wanted to add that it's funny. Well, you brought this up before, but in my experience growing up, I didn't really understand math until I started taking physics. And that's because physics, especially when we're like doing not particular physics, but like, your normal trajectory or projectile motion physics, where we're studying parabolas and quadratic equations and stuff like that. That's when everything started to click. The mathematics for me, because before then it was all okay, I'm just like pushing the numbers. So I love that you brought that up, that in the low testing environment where teachers resisted the testing, students were able to make real world connections with their with math. And I think that's very important in education.
Right. Yeah, and that happens when we create learning opportunities for students that don't necessarily result in a B, C, or D answer, right?
So, and actually, that's one thing that I'm notoriously bad at standardized tests, but I'm very good at exams where I have room to explain my mathematics and using the theory to come up with an answer. And I always thought that the education system, even coming to graduate school, relies heavily on standardized tests. And I really don't think it really shows what students can do. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I agree, right? Like standardized assessments are not necessarily the best way to capture what students know. And it really pushes us to think about, when we're assessing, are we assessing for learning, or are we assessing the learning that happened, right? And even when we're thinking about assessing the learning that happened, that's still, it's still not a adequate picture of what students have learned, right? Students learn so much. And when we think about currently in distance learning, students have learned how to navigate Zoom better than some of us know how to do.
Yes, that's
right?
true.
But we don't accept that, right? Mm-hmm. So students are learning, and students do learn. And so it's really thinking about, like, standardized assessments don't quite capture learning in ways that more formative assessments could, right? So there are many other ways that we could do it. The fortunate part is that we struggle with thinking about how can we do it large scale. And how can we do it in an economic way, right? It requires more, if we're thinking about using rubrics, using portfolios, it requires more investment in time, more investment in resources. But I still would argue that we've invested so much into standardized assessments, right? With like millions of dollars get sent to these companies that create these assessments that are used. Why can't we use those millions of dollars to pay people to do that work?
Exactly. And don't you think that in a more computerized society, suddenly these ways of assessment may be more feasible?
I'd like maybe. Possibly. Okay. It would also depend on who is creating these algorithms for ways of assessing things through like a computer or a system, right? I think our colleague AJ recently published a piece, right, that says that like maybe essays are not the best way for us to know about students, because it maybe mostly just tells us about I think it's like socioeconomic class. It's a better read through essays.
Yes. I actually really wanted to have AJ on this episode too, because I thought you two would have a really good back and forth another time. But and so I think you did touch on your interpretive work. That's like watching the classrooms. Can you explain to us the interpretive process? How are you getting data from watching these videos, and how can you measure your data?
Yeah. So I can say a little bit more of what I'm currently doing, right?
Okay,
so right now I look at, I'm in a fourth grade classroom, over Zoom, which is in itself very interesting. But I get to sort of see the classroom, right? Like, what is the teacher doing? What does the teacher say to the students? How do the students take that up? How do the students then engage with each other in a small group? So like drawing on theory that has been established within mathematics education, particularly around opportunities to learn. So like how the teacher talks to students, the language that's used, right? So does she praise students for getting right answers, or does she praise students for effort? Right. And it's sort of like, oh, I love being able to see the teacher say, like, ask for celebrations, and students celebrating their classmates and saying, I want to celebrate Adam because he was struggling with the problem, but he kept going and then he got it, right? Or like they made a mistake. They didn't give up. They continued working on the problem. They fixed their mistake, and then they got it, right? So it's creating those spaces where, or giving authorship to students. So today I was observing the class, and there is an example where the teacher credited the students for sharing a strategy, right? So when helping another student, she said, "Oh, why don't you try doing the strategy that Adam shared? Why don't you try doing the strategy that Jessica shared," right? So it's giving credit to the students as opposed to saying like, here's a strategy that I'm telling you to use. It's saying, right, giving authorship to the other students, highlighting their voices. And I think that creates a space where students see themselves in the classroom space, and they see themselves as capable of doing math and learning math.
As intellectuals, being a part of the process. And that's really great positive reinforcement, which is something that's very important at a young age. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, so part of that interpretive work is like seeing what I find in the literature and showing up in the classroom in the practice of both the teaching and how the students engage with each other.
Oh, I love that. So you're I know a lot of times in like higher education in general, we come up with all of these ways to remedy the issues that are happening outside of the academia bubble, but it never gets translated because it's just hard to transfer into real life. And so I love that you're highlighting these things that the theory in the real world. So
right.
That's very important work. Yeah. And so I'd love to ask you, in a nutshell, how will your work impact our understanding of the American education system? Is that a big...
It is a big question, right? And I think I would be hard pressed to say that I know exactly how it will impact, but I can maybe speak to how I hope it will impact.
I love that. Yeah.
I hope that it will help us think of an alternative to how to think about assessment for learning, right? Like we really want to think about supporting students to learn, see themselves as life learners, lifelong learners. For me, it's very important to think about how can we use math to make sense of and shape the world around us.
Yes.
And it's hard to think about using math in those ways when a lot of our instruction is centered and focused around getting students prepared for taking these assessments at the end of the year, that hold a lot of weight for students and for teachers, right? And for schooling systems. So like currently, right now, I hope that my research highlights that we shouldn't be doing assessments in pandemic times. Like
exactly.
They should not be happening. I mean, they're still happening, right? Like I know I've been talking to teachers in Texas who are currently testing. Like they are already doing 4-hour testing for their students. They're bringing students who have been at home because they don't feel safe coming to schools, back to schools just for testing. And there has to be an alternative for us to think about how do we do assessment for learning and push us towards countering this idea that we need to be standardized across the board, right? Like students are coming to us with like different knowledge, different levels of knowledge, different futures for them that don't fit within this box of standardized assessments. And I hope that my work can impact that. We need a different alternative, and we need a different vision of what education should be. And then also do hope to be able to highlight that teachers are professionals within their field. They do a lot of sense making on the spot and in their planning, and they hold a lot of responsibility that their input should be taken into consideration when we consider policy and teachers should be part of the conversation around policy reform.
I like that you said that. I remember a teacher in my high school in Jamaica saying how we used to learn in preparation of exams, and the teacher said that many of the examiners or the people who wrote questions were college professors and not teachers themselves, and that was a problem. So thanks for raising that point. Do you think there will be long-term effects because of the pandemic, like lifelong, or do you think that our brains are plastic enough to fix itself over time?
Oh yeah, kids? Absolutely. I think that students will definitely overcome. I'm not of the mind. I'm actually strongly opposed to the idea of seeing students as having learning loss. Again, to the point, they've learned so much, right? But it's sort of what are we choosing to focus on as our measurements of learning? We've asked students to continue at the pace that we would in a normal school year under unconventional circumstances and unprecedented circumstances, right? So I definitely believe that students will overcome it, and I hesitate to say that there like be strong effects in terms of seeing students from a deficit perspective.
Okay.
I do believe that it'll change, hopefully for the better. It's definitely highlighted a lot of the inequalities that exist within our current system, educational system, and I hope that there is the hope that it'll push us towards rectifying those inequities. But again, just wanting to steer away from thinking that students will have deficits and losses in their knowledge, because that's not true.
Not true.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's something I've been wondering about. And so last but not least, this is my favorite question. What misconceptions of graduate school would you like to dispel?
One of them being that you don't have to be an exceptional straight A student, right? You don't have to have perfect test scores throughout your K-12 schooling to be a grad student. There's more to graduate school than just coursework.
Yes.
There's this belief that, you're just taking classes, constantly taking classes, more classes, but we do so much. There's teaching that happens, there's research that's happens. So it's more broad of an idea of being in graduate school, but I think particularly that you don't belong in graduate school. There is no perfect picture of who belongs in graduate school. No. And if that's something that you want to do, definitely go for it. And I think one suggestion I have for others is like reach out to people.
Yes.
Don't be afraid to reach out and just try to connect with others to answer questions that you have about graduate school.
Thank you for that answer. I've gotten many people have said the same thing, that it's not just all A's. And we're not always taking classes, we're doing research and trying to contribute to our fields. So thank you so much, Rosa. I really enjoyed this interview, and thank you for explaining education and your research to us. And I can't wait to meet you in person. I always see you every Monday in their class. But, fingers crossed, with the pandemic over, we can finally have an in-person meetup. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Yes, definitely. All right. Bye.
Hello everyone, thank you for watching the completion of this interview with Rosa Chavez. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe to the channel because that helps me so much, and stay tuned for next week.